Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 Singapore Literature Festival in New York City. My name is G. Leong Ko, and I'm the founder and organizer of Singapore Unbound and your host tonight. I'm wearing a gray shirt and sitting in my home office with a shelf of books behind me. My preferred pronouns are he, him. Organized by the New York City-based literary nonprofit Singapore Unbound, Singapore Literature Festival brings together Singaporean and American authors and audiences for readings and discussions. Appropriately, the festival theme this year is The Politics of Hope. We acknowledge gratefully the sponsorship of Ethos Books and many private champions, as well as the support of our co-presenters, New Narrative, the Evergreen Review, Asia Society, Adelphi University's MFA program and Soapbox series, NYU English Department's Post-Colonial Race and Diaspora Studies Colloquium, the Southeast Asian Studies program at the University of California, Riverside, and Books Actually. Tonight, for the launch of the US edition of Tania De Rosario's memoir, And the Walls Come Crumbling Down, published by Gaudy Boy, we will hear both Tania and author Leah Piepzna-Samarasinha read and engage in conversation about queerness and writing. Our co-presenter for this event is Books Actually, Singapore's favorite indie bookshop. But first, let me introduce you to our event moderator, Judy Luo. Judy Luo is assistant editor at Gaudy Boy, where she's devoted to amplifying Asian literary voices that open radical political possibilities. A student and an abolitionist organizer, Judy is finishing her degree in carceral studies at New York University's Gallatin School of Individualized Study. Please welcome Judy. Before I go, I will ask all our speakers to speak slowly and clearly so that the closed captioner can capture what you say. Thank you. Over to you, Judy.
Thank you for the introduction, G. I'm Judy Luo, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm wearing a white tank top in my sister's room, sitting against a white wall. I'm so excited to introduce our two authors tonight. First to read is Leah Piepzna-Samarasinha. Leah is the author of Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice, Dirty River, a queer femme of color dreaming her way home, which she will read from today, Body Map, and Love Cake. They are also the co-editor of The Revolution Starts at Home, Confronting Intimate Violence in Activist Communities, and a lead artist with Sins Invalid. Following Leah, Tania De Rosario will read for us. Tania is a writer and visual artist. She is the author of Tender Delirium and Somewhere Else Another You. Born in Singapore, she lives and works on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, colonially known as Vancouver. So now I'd love to warmly invite Leah to read.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Judy, for that amazing introduction. And thank you to everybody who's been a part of making this incredibly important festival happen. I said from the beginning, when you guys first reached out to me 4 months ago, it's such an honor as someone with diasporic Malaysian and Singaporean Sri Lankan roots who's queer to be invited to be part of this cultural work. My name is Leah Piepzna-Samarasinha. I am a sand-colored, middle-aged aging punk femme with Sri Lankan, Roma, and Irish roots. Graying brown curly hair on one side of my head and an undercut on the other, hot pink lipstick, big glasses, and earrings with, you might not be able to see it, there's an image of Sylvia Rivera, who is one of the people who created Stonewall when she was living on the piers in New York in the late 90s. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Duwamish Nation, governed by the 1865 Treaty of Fort Elliott. And I'm so happy to be here in this of all times. And it was really special to be asked to read from this book, which is 5 years old this year, Dirty River, which I was just reflecting. I was like, it was the memoir I started 10 years before it got published, and which really changed a lot in the work of writing it. I always tell people that books will tell you how they want to be written, and it's not what you think they are when you start writing, because they are anarchists in unceded territories. It's a real honor to be asked to come back to this book. It's been a minute since I've been able to sit with her, so thank you. I'm going to read from two sections. The first is called Punk Desi Girls. And just to set the scene a little bit, this book is set in a lot of different times and places, but the moment that this describes is the late 90s in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, Dishwitz One Spoon territories. Amina, Vashti, Anjali, Leila, Sharmini. You were the weird queer brown girls who made me move here. You were the weird queer brown girls who showed me how to be brown, who showed that all the ways there were to be a South Asian weird queer femme. Booze can, red lights in the basement, another after hours benefit for prison news service at the South Africa Center in Kensington Market, 1996. Anjali danced in a flannel over a thermal, her shaved head dyed green, growing in. The dye half washed out, giving her hair that looked like mold was growing in it the green dye gives you when it washes out. Dancing in her plaid shirt over her hoodie, over thermal and jeans, she was still femme, delicate, jumping up on the table and shimmying to Biggie singing More Money, More Problems. I went up to her and I started raving, South Asian this, South Asian that. And she was like, oh, do you identify as a South Asian? Not hostile, just asking. Anjali hung out with Gordon and that girl whose name I can't remember who never talked, bald-headed and silent. They hung in a tight pack of 21-year-old roommate queer kids who had all run away from their families. Years later, I'd see Anjali gyrating on another table, drunk as hell, $134 bill for all the tequila waiting for her on the table. That night, she cornered me in the bathroom and screamed at me, I just want to know, sometimes you smile at me and sometimes you don't. What's up with that? I didn't know what to say. I said, sometimes I smile at you and sometimes I don't, and I walked away. She was dramalicious, one of those ones you needed the most, who maybe needed you the most. Why were they always like that? Amina was fat, beautifully fat, like the sexiest hippo you'd ever see, with that gorgeous gap between her front teeth, her magnificent breasts, her head wraps worn over her crinkly hair. Redwa, her girlfriend, was short and skinny and had that rooster boy butch haircut, little wire glasses, nutmeg brown skin. They were hot like fuck together. Together, they ran the one Desi music show that appeared on any of the city's radio stations, the one that all of the city's Desi listened to, from the community radio station in the basement at Ryerson. That had mics and headphones held together with duct tape. And they talked about domestic violence and Desi gays in 1996 because they had a captive audience. There was no other place for anyone to listen to our music, so everyone listened in. Amina looked like a vision of something different, like a future I wanted but hadn't seen yet. She was brown and femme. She rocked those ice cream white pantsuits and bejeweled shuffles, the hottest, shiniest magenta shalwars tight across her breasts. She said that word femme. She said it out loud. And she was a Desi from somewhere else, one of those other Desis, just like me. She was going to law school. She talked about being molested. She wrote erotica. I wanted to grow up to be just like her, shining behind the turntables, creating a whole community, a badass brown girl thriving despite all the cold. The first time I saw Leila, I caught my breath at her phenotype. I knew some folks would think she was white, but me, I could read her question. Her eyes were mestiza hazel, just like mine, big old beautiful cow eyes, her nose just like my dad's, that same exact half white, half brown shade of skin that I had. She was a raver and she danced all night at all of the best and most famous clubs and threw her head back and laughed and was vulnerable behind it all. Had a white working class Northern Ontario mom and an Indo-Guyanese dad, and she reminded me so much of myself, I didn't even know how to say it. When I saw her at Krishanta's poetry launch at the community room of the St. Jamestown housing projects that we all called Sanjay Town because there were so many Sri Lankans who lived there, I walked up to her and said abruptly and awkwardly, "Are you Burger?" And she said, "No." And I said, "I am. Okay then," and moved away to sit with Raphael. She teased me about it for years afterwards, about how shitty and awkward my social skills were. I knew. I was okay for her teasing. I was so desperate to find kin, it was worth being that awkward. But the point was, we recognized each other. We kept recognizing each other. Charmony was another one who could pass or not. Who was looking? Was it not being visible? Or was it about how people knew how to see? She was creamy too, with that one curl quirked over her eye. She was also a raver. She was lovers with Vishnu, that tamarind bean pod Trini queer boy. You girls, you showed me in quick moments, awkward conversations, all we had. Walking through Kensington Market and Parkdale, so many shades of brown, and there was one that called my name. Thank you. And real quick, thank you. Oh my God, thank you so much. This is the second excerpt I'll read, and it's called Dad Again. When I came out to my dad, I was 21 years old and about to leave the house forever. We were in the basement where he always was. Old brown couch I used to jump on when I was 6 with all the kids from the block, all the lights out, a tumbler of Johnny Walker Red by his right hand. That's what he did on weekends, sit on the basement and drink the brown liquor. I can't touch scotch now, or I can, but I don't want to, because while I am my father's child in so many ways, there are so many ways I don't want to be like him. He was Johnny Walker, the History Channel on low, staying up till 4 a.m. when he finally passed out, then getting up 2 hours later to catch the commuter rail into the city for work. I wasn't planning on having the big queer conversation with him. I was actually trying to have an awkward as hell conversation about me getting married to Raphael so I could stay in Canada. I figured he'd understand. We'd switched countries so many times in so many sketchy ways that it was more of a family tradition than a family secret. I remember him saying, but what if you want to do something that Raphael doesn't want you to do? It's very serious, marriage. I remember telling him it was for the papers, that we were both queer, and I remember most of all him saying in the dark, well, what do you think I did before I married your mother? In the hostels? In London, where he lived with his super best, super pretty friend, David from Trinidad, always pronounced as one word, for years before he met my mother. You do whatever you want. You just get married. I let the silence be after that. I knew there could be no further discussion. But I also knew my dad had just told me that in proud Sri Lankan tradition, he'd gotten it on with men. My dad was a pretty, pretty man. In his youth, a skinny, brown, elegant boy, tall and long with big, deep eyes, skin the color of tobacco leather, and thick, straight black jute hair, all angles and long legs. Now he was middle-aged and going silver with more sad lines around his eyes and mouth, still mournful and fine. When we went to Provincetown for day trips in the summer, he'd get hit on constantly. He'd act like he hated it, but he'd walk ahead of my mother and me, strolling, hands behind his back. Was he remembering Galface Green, the Sri Lankan park, or the beach near Kuala Lumpur? Was he remembering a different sun, browner men, the train tracks behind Bambala Pitya station, cock and mouth on his knees, 1965? If Freud is right at all, and anything other than an asshole, I guess it makes sense that my father's daughter grew up to fuck and love brown, faggoty, sexy ass, masculine people, any generation of queer. I'll stop there. Thank you so much. Also, Tanya, congratulations on your book. I'm so honored to be here. Okay, I'm gonna mute now.
Am I on? Sorry. Thank you so much, Leah. I love your book. And I also enjoyed like how we have such different stories, but so many intersections in our stories. And also just learned from you that your book was also around 10 years in the making, which also has a similarity to mine. Anyway, yes, sorry, I'll begin. My name is Tania De Rosario. I'm wearing a black top and I'm sitting in my living room. My pronouns are she and her. I just want to say thank you so much to Gaudy Boy and Singapore Unbound for republishing this book, as well as um, holding this event. It's very meaningful that I think I'm getting a book that's essentially about home republished just when I'm trying to make a new home in a new country. So thank you. For context, the book is divided into 3 sections comprising short chapters, and in the middle section, all the chapters are named after parts of the house. So this chapter is called Roof, and it's a chapter about my grandmother. My grandmother sits in her wheelchair, eyes on the television set. She sees moving images but doesn't understand them. She rocks back and forth, frail hands clutching armrests. She calls out random words to Warina, who comforts her with random words in return. Now and then, when I sneak home to see her, she doesn't recognize me. She's aged more years than I've been gone. 3 years since I moved out of my mother's flat, but perhaps moved is not an accurate term. It's not like I packed all my belongings into cardboard boxes, sealed them with tape, and stacked them into a van. No. I carried things out bit by bit, a few items each day in small plastic bags. Each day, I placed them into my new house until there was nothing left to carry. And then, without a word, I just never came back. Anything I could not lug myself, I found a way to do without. Items prioritize themselves quickly when you have limited resources and only one pair of hands. 6 years old. My grandmother would carry my school bag while she waited with me for the school bus. Rats inhabited the drain nearby. As a child, I always thought it was the same rat. I used to wait eagerly for it to come out. I called it Rodney. My grandmother, or Nana as I called her, was disgusted at the idea that I would name a rat. Nana can't carry anything now, not even what's left of her own weight. She wears diapers and calls Warina mother. She shouts it loudly so that it can be heard throughout the flat. She shouts it during breakfast from the dining room that links all our bedroom doors. She shouts it, rocking back and forth, pushing away the food that any of us try to feed her. They say that when a child is born, the parent looks after it, and when the parent grows old, the child returns the favor. Asian values positions this as an obligation instead of an act of love, my duty to bear forever the weight of someone else's choice. I was born an only child. My parents split when my mother was pregnant, and my father died from suicide 9 years later. I'd never met him, so it was unfelt loss as my mother lay crying in my arms. All I knew of him was what I'd find combing through my mother's drawers years later. Divorce papers denoting adultery, photos he'd taken of her on their honeymoon, a scrapbook she'd made for him as a teenager. I'm making my parents sound almost human. Perhaps they were once. My father sailed the seas for work and my mother put pen to paper. My Scorpio parents who made me, the Pisces, twin fishes swimming in circles and never stopping. When my mother grew tired of dealing with life, she too died a little in order to get reborn. This involved joining a Pentecostal church, much to my grandmother's Roman Catholic despair. There was war every day over whether the statue of the infant Jesus was a dirty idol or emblem of faith. My mother always won because we lived under her roof. That we lived under her roof would in fact dictate a number of tyrannies that would eventually define puberty, even though we lived in a flat, which meant having only a ceiling and no roof. When it was decided unilaterally, as it always was, that the statue was an idol, my grandmother would weep as she put it back into the cupboard. She did this so that my mother would stop shouting and I would stop crying. And then each of us to our own retreats. Mother in the room with her Bible, me in my room with my color pencils, Nana in the kitchen over the stove. When I think of Nana, I always think of food. Why is it we so often associate cooking with our grandmothers? I remember with clarity her shepherd's pie, her spaghetti, her devil's curry. I think about the hours I would spend in the kitchen watching her going about making magic with raw ingredients. All good smells lead back to her. 13 years old. I shunned cooking as a symbol of backwardness. I was going to be a liberated woman who was not tied to her stove. I spent a large portion of my teenhood proud of the fact that I'd never boiled an egg. I thought this made me a modern woman. I loved it when people were appalled. An empty bank account, rented house, and stolen pot later. I faced the stove without a choice. How could I have known that cooking would be the final act that liberated me? Over the course of 2 decades, meals with my family got worse and worse. When my grandmother lost everything that helped her make sense of the world, my mother felt compelled to compensate for the silence that befell the table. She chatted endlessly of her successes, her clients, and her virtues, and after each proclamation, gave thanks to God. To this day, I find it difficult talking about myself and the life I've made. I would readily choose the sound of cutlery clicking its tongue against plates over having to deal with her voice in my throat. It was a matter of time before my grandmother grew too deaf to hear her, and I just learned to eat fast and leave. 3 generations of women at one table, all held together by blood and excuses and this metaphorical roof above our heads. Dinner after dinner, day after day, year after year. I destroyed that thread. I remember the day I knew I wanted to leave. 17 years old, in the hospital, Nana had suffered a stroke and I was by her bed. She was semi-conscious, drugged, unable to speak, half her face unable to emote. Suddenly, phantoms of people I'd known from church moving in masses descended upon her bed. She couldn't have known what was going on. Thank God, they repeated, that she was alive. Praise God, they said, for sparing her. They began to pray. Their volume grew with their passion. I dragged my mother to a corner. I'm going to leave, I said, if they didn't. They were causing a ruckus, voices inflated with ego, not spirit. People were staring, and I was gigantic with rage. The nurse was at a loss and did not know what to do. Nana was distressed. Or maybe it was I who was distressed. 12 years old again, grabbed and pulled into my bedroom, the glazed look in my grandmother's eyes as she sat at the dining table. She'd crushed a framed image of the Last Supper with a hammer they had given her. Mother telling me that Nana had been saved before they started shouting at me, pulling at my clothes, telling me that demons possessed my body and that they had to be cast out. Unnatural tendencies, they told my mother. They spoke the word lesbian as if it was dirty, and then my room stripped bare of belongings and put to flames upon our stove. I snarled and struggled and screamed, but they annulled my rage. All resistance was the devil, and nothing was mine. Do these people not know what anger is? It's not of the devil. I possess it. It does not possess me. And if there is one thing left I own, it is that. It sits at the core of who I am, and you will never cast it out. In the hospital ward, I felt something in me die. My mother and I, standing at arm's length, glaring at each other. Last chance, I thought. I would have forgiven her everything had she picked me. Would have forgiven her for choosing so many times book over blood, dogma over daughter. Choose me. I belong to you. I am more than the myth of some made up story. I am flesh. I am blood. I am yours. Choose me. When I look at my grandmother, I wonder whether any part of her remembers me. Any part that might still be tied to long lost games of snakes and ladders, storytelling, and Holy Communion. When I look at my grandmother, I wonder whether she has an answer for the time between waiting for school buses and waiting for me, the only daughter of her only daughter who left one day and just never came home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya and Leah, for your tender, at the same time, really, really powerful readings. I think your respective works really speak to each other, as you said, Tanya, on these themes of survival as a queer person, resistance, and home. And I'm really excited to unpack this more in the Q&A. So for the audience, if you have any questions for Tanya and Leah, please type them into the chat and I'll be happy to ask them on your behalf. As folks are sort of warming up and coming up with their questions, I'll begin with mine. Tanya and Leah, I'm really curious as to how you envision your writing, in particular, your personal writing, as a moving part of political resistance. In other words, I'm curious about why you chose to document a part of your life in this way, and your thoughts on the role of this kind of art in breaking open and building towards alternative futures.
Oh, me? Okay, I was gonna be like, do you want to go? I can go, but do you want to go first, Tanya? No, okay. That's like the $6 million question, right? But there's a lot I could say. I mean, I think that the first thing that comes to mind is just something I said a lot when Dirty River came out, which is that I think that memoirs are, in the words of Janet Mock, possibility models, right? Like I got my life saved by books, right? I was shown different ways that I could possibly be in the world other than what my family and my community gave me. And especially as a queer person who was growing up in the 80s, like that saved my life. Like I moved to New York because I read a Sarah Schulman novel. And I was like, oh, there's this whole mixed race queer community full of drama on the Lower East Side. Great, I'll move there. And, you know, that's why I focused on applying to colleges and getting scholarships in New York. And for me, when I started writing Dirty River, I mean, when I first started, this is so embarrassing, but I had just read Michelle T's book, Valencia, which is so white. And it's serious, but it's a lot of very wacky stories about crazy shit that happened when she was drunk. And I was kind of like, I can write some crazy stories. I've been through some quote unquote crazy shit. And then the more I worked on it, I was like, but this is like a mixed race brown queer abuse survivor narrative. Like my crazy stuff is like dealing with Canadian immigration, being in a queer abusive relationship, like all of this intergenerational stuff. And you know, when I looked around, I was like, at the time I was still working, among other jobs, I was working at a rape crisis hotline that was very queer, very people of color. But, when I looked at like the abuse survivor memoirs that were out there, they were all white, I mean, with some notable exceptions. And a lot of the notable exceptions were a generation older than me, like I love Sapphire, I love Christos, I love Alice Walker, but I was like, where all of the writing I was seeing, I was 26 in 2001, and the new queer writing I was seeing, quote unquote, was all white in terms of books, which is starting to be different now, in some places. So I just was like, I want to tell a brown queer abuse survivor story. And I especially really wanted to fuck with the narrative of tragic overcoming, or normalizing, or things like that, or like, oh, you just heal and everything's a meadow of flowers. Like, and that it's just about like, you go to your therapist and it's lovely. And I was like, well, it's me and my two best friends doing this kind of bootleg Diwali, in this shitty apartment and just loving each other and then getting into a big fight. And I want to write that down. So, I mean, I think that, and I not to be like, my life has been so hard, but the process of publishing Dirty River, the 10 years, was partly that I was working 15 jobs at the same time and super busy, and partly that I needed to come to different places of healing to be able to tell certain stories or figure out how to enter into them. But also there were so many publishers who were like, it can be a queer story or an abuse story, and there's too many kinds of abuse, that's complicated, and why is it funny? And I don't, and I was like, this is life, and that feels important. But what I'm getting to is that like, there's so many people who wrote me who were like, I read this in the psych ward, I live in the building next to the building you used to live in Toronto. And most of all that people were like, I wrote my own book, I wrote my own narrative. And I think especially for, Black and brown queer people, I remember reading, I still think about a launch I did in Montreal where this other young queer South Asian femme was like, literally, if I tell the kind of stories you are, my parents will kill me. And I mean, really kill me. And I was like, no, me too. That's why I left the country. I have this barrier. So I think that especially for those of us who are multiply marginalized and in small communities where there's so much stuff around shame, saving face, not making the family look bad, it's really, but we do need to tell our stories, right? Like, it's really life-saving. It's like a lifeboat, or like the thing you throw when you're in the lifeboat to somebody else, to be like, I told this and I didn't die. And sorry, last but not least, I'll say that I think that as Sri Lankans, you know, one of our big resistance traditions is writing. You know, I was on a Sri Lankan panel. It was like one of the last public events before COVID in North America, where it was me and other Sri Lankan writers, and we were just like, yeah, like I was like, my life was saved by Shyam Selvadurai, Shyam Selvadarui. His book Funny Boy. I mean, my father, my closeted father, you know, 1994 was like, there's this man writing about us, and you know, he's like us. And I read it, I'm like, he's gay, Dad. And, you know, Shyam told so many different stories about queerness, about the Civil War, about Tamilness, about, you know, women who enforced marriage, like all kinds of stuff. And he created room in the diaspora for us to have those conversations and imagine life, imagine different ways of being Sri Lankan, and showing that we were already doing those different ways. So, and I think especially during the war and after, there have been so many Sri Lankan writers on and off the island where we're doing essential work in writing down things that various forces don't want us to say. You know, so be the weird queer cousin who writes, you know, whatever you have to do. Sorry, that was a lot. I'm going to stop talking, but that's my thought. Tanya, what do you think? Sorry, knock the laptop.
Yeah, I think that especially that kind of final sum up of write the thing that the forces don't want you to write really resonates with me. When I started writing Walls, I didn't know it was going to be a book. I was just writing like little short bits that I needed to write because I'm like trapped here with a fly. That was not part of my sentence, but I was writing short bits to just really cope with my life. Like I had a lot of big feelings about things that had happened and were happening, and I was not coping well with them. I was self-harming. I was in a, you know, just a generally bad place. And instinctually, I just felt I needed to write because I needed to put these feelings that were very amorphous and were controlling me into words so that I could try and control them. That was how the book started. But to answer, you know, specifically the question of where I think, you know, work like ours sits in the larger political sphere, I think, you know, coming from a country where sex between men is still illegal, where positive portrayals of queer characters are not allowed on public television, where, yeah, I mean, coming from a country where that is the situation, I think it is important to put out cultural production that tells a different story, that brings, you know, struggles and humanity of queer characters or all marginalized characters kind of to the surface, and you know, makes them available for people to read about. I mean, it's pretty, sounds quite basic, but that's truly what I believe. Also, I think for me, and again, I always quote poet Cyril Wong when I say this, where at a panel someone asked what was his, you know, motivation for writing, and he said, I'm looking for people like me. And I think that's also largely why I write, and largely why I put the writing out there, because I'm looking for people like me. And for me, affirmation has always come in the form of young queer people telling me that the book resonated with them. And yeah, to me, that is the part the work plays. It connects people who might otherwise feel isolated. I mean, I think in a very big sense, I try to write what I needed to read when I was a teenager, before the days of the internet, before we had, you know, easier access to other queer people. I think that's the role.
Thank you so much, Tanya and Leah. I have a question from Guy, and I think it's sort of connected to the first question. They ask, how or why did you choose the memoir form to tell these stories? And was that instinctive, or was there second thought? I mean, as opposed to autobiographical fiction or poetry. And I know that both of your works are sort of, you know, experimental hybrid genre in that way, but maybe like a little bit about, why the focus or the spotlight on the personal, or the personal narrative as opposed to something else.
Honestly, I didn't know much about writing or publishing when I started writing the chapters in this book. And I was writing it for my blog. To give you an indicator of how long ago that was, my blog was on multiply.com. Have you heard of it? No, that's how long ago it was. And so I was writing for this small, group of friends who were following me on that blog. And to me, in my brain, blogging was about blogging about your life. So it was kind of, my instinct was just to kind of communicate those stories as as nonfiction, as creative nonfiction, and as memoir.
Yeah, and for me, it's interesting. I think the phrase "writing yourself into existence" comes to me. Or we used to say, I used to co-run this queer and trans people of color performance troupe, Mangoes with Chili, and we used to talk about writing ourselves into existence because it was 2006, and man, we were different. Like people were like, "Who? It's all of you? None of you are white?" And we were like, "Yep, yep." And it was. I mean, yeah, it's the thing that like in my head too. Tanya, you said it. I'm like, oh, it sounds basic, but there's something about seeing some version of you in a book or on stage that is really life changing, even if the person who's on in the book or on stage is saying things that aren't quite you or you disagree with, right? I think for me, I started out as a poet and I still am. And then there was a period where my best friend at the time was like, but you tell stories, you're a storyteller, And I mean, I came up in very slam spoken word community, which is wonderful. And also there was a point I got to that I think a lot of people get to, where I was just like, I want to tell stories that are longer than 3 minutes and don't just have, that aren't kind of geared towards competing and having everyone in the room be like, yeah, at the end. Like I was like, I want to have longer to tell the story. And I was like, I can't write a book that's not poetry. I can't write fiction. I can't write memoir. What is this? And then she was just like, just write your story down and see, just follow it to see where it takes you. So, and I think my voice as a poet and my voice as a memoirist are very interrelated. I think that, I mean, it's a real different set of skills because like memoir, I was like, oh God, this is a lot longer to edit. There's so much more words, but I think it gave me an eye for specificity and an ability to tell stories that didn't have to be linear or just kind of have a like beginning, tension, conclusion, typical narrative, which felt really important because I think stories of surviving abuse, diaspora, queerness don't function neatly that way, right? Like I wanted to kind of time travel. I wanted to have everything happen at once. And in terms of why the personal, like I think, again, I'll just say that like, some of the first places that I really experienced writing as liberation was being 16 and reading zines, like little handmade, stapled together, mailed to each other pieces of paper. And a lot of them in the 90s were young people who were abuse survivors and feminists and queers telling each other our stories, and it saved my life. And for that reason, I just kind of thought, okay, you can do it, and there's different ways you can do it. There's different ways you can tell the personal story, and that, like, again, literally, someone, no matter how specific your personal experience is. I mean, it's something I tell writing students all the time, that it's a very easy trap to fall into when, especially when you're multiply marginalized. You think, oh, this is too specific, no one's going to get it, right? So you just kind of generalize your writing. But my teacher, the great Palestinian poet Suhair Hamad, she said, I had written this very generic like revolution poem, and she was like, why don't you write about being a half Sri Lankan girl in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1983? And she's like, if you write it good enough, everyone's going to follow that. It doesn't matter how specific it is. It doesn't matter. There might be like 5 other people with your racial background in the world. Like if you tell the story right, everyone's going to hook into it. And and she's like, they teach us as queer writers, as writers of color, that, oh, we're too specific, white guys are general, white guys are the world. And she's like, that's bullshit. It's bullshit. So I think that those are the reasons. Yeah. Great question.
Thank you. I think both of you are speaking to sort of how like uniquely when the writer is able to shape the personal narrative with their own loving voice, with their voice that's steeped in that experience. It really touches people in different ways. I have a question from Tara, and she asks, have there been any political repercussions for either of you after publication in your home countries?
I like to say, and I may feel free, anyone from Singapore who's here to correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like poetry and maybe literature in general in Singapore is one of those spaces that slips under the radar a lot. It's much less policed because it's in, and again, this is in my opinion, a lot of people view it as being less accessible. For example, than what gets shown on TV or what gets put in a cinema, or even sometimes what gets put on stage. There is much less, every time you have a visual exhibition or a film screening or theater or an exhibition, you have to apply for a license. Every piece of work in the exhibition has the image has to be given to the Media Development Authority. It's a whole thing. It's a whole process. And literature kind of escapes that, right? And for a lot of other media, I'll give you the example I always give, which is when I wanted to screen a short animation, under 1 minute animation by Canadian artist Alicia Lim back in 2012. The animation was given an NC-16 rating, which meant that if I wanted to screen it, I had to pay a $10,000 deposit. And it was because of queer content. And the queer content was one character asking themselves, am I gay? So books don't get that kind of scrutiny, and don't get that kind of what I call backdoor censorship, but what is otherwise called regulation by the state. Yeah, so I've personally not received any repercussions for content, at least for queer content. I think with books, the thing that is more policed is content that has to do with government directly.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, I think it's a role that as Sri Lankan writers in the West we get to play, which is that we're much less censored than if we were on the island, right? Like, I mean, I think it's creative writing does slip under a bit, but also in Lanka it doesn't as much. And for journalism, I mean, the whoever wins this award that keeps changing, but there was a period actually after the war ended, which we always put in quotes, where we were the most dangerous place for journalists in the world, right? Like listen to Wickramasinghe and like so many other journalists being assassinated for telling the truth, right? Telling different truths. And I think that for some of us as creative writers in the West, we have a little bit more leeway. And because it's creative, it's seen as a story. Even if it's memoir, it's a story. It's not like, well, the president did this, right? Or even if it is, it's a little bit far away. So I think a lot about playing my position, and I think that I'm proud of the fact that there's, my books are, on the island, and people are like, yeah, I was in barefoot and I picked up your first book of poetry and now I'm here, I'm in school and we're meeting, and I'm like, that's really good. And there has been that cultural exchange of especially younger Sri Lankan writers going back and forth, like those of us who were refugees or migrated in some way, traveling back to the island, whether it's to live or to visit, and there being that cultural exchange that feels super important. Especially, I mean, there were so many Tamil women who created plays and writing anonymously, during the worst of the repression, who are my heroes. I mean, they did incredible work to just tell stories about everything from, government repression and murder to domestic violence, right? When there was so much censorship and repression. And I'm glad to be part of a small crew of queer Sri Lankan writers in diaspora who are in conversation with those women, right? And other writers. And that continues to be so important. But not so much, no. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to say, I was going to say, I wish there was, and I'm like, I don't. But I want there to be a future where those of us who are in diaspora, who are living in outside lands, and those of us who are in home countries, where there's no war and repression, and we get to travel with ease, and we get to be in communication and conversation with each other. Like, that's what I want, right? Yeah, and I mean, finally, I'll say being mixed and light-skinned and estranged from my family is both, I mean, the estranged from my family part is hard and also a complicated blessing, but it allows me room to say things that other people I know who are still like, I have 300 cousins I talk to every day on WhatsApp, right? And they all know where I live. They're like, you can get away from it more. And I'm like, yeah, it's an absolute privilege. It's an absolute privilege. And I have to be mindful of that and try and use it wisely and also step out of the way.
Thank you so much. I think for the next question, Leah, you started to answer this, but we have a question from Joanne who poses, how do you grapple with the ethics of depicting real people in your writing? Have you felt the need to alter details to protect or anonymize them?
I think for this book, anyone who was not my bio family, I did not mention names. But you know, with regards to my mother, and I mean, it was mainly my mother, right? With regards to my mother, I felt, ethically speaking, my standpoint was, if you didn't want me to talk about it, you shouldn't have done it. But also, uh, we have we have a different surname, so there was one bit removed. So not many people would know she was my mother. But also, I knew that she was someone who was very much about saving face, so it's not something she would have brought up anyway. She wouldn't have complained about it publicly. Um, Although I do have to say that now that my whole bio family is dead, I feel much safer about this issue.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I agree with that quote about if they didn't want you to write about them, they should have been nicer, and I just fundamentally feel like we all have the right to tell our stories. Like, if my father wanted to write a story, I'd be like, okay, I'm not going to read it necessarily, but go for it. You can tell your version of the truth. Um, I really felt, I think a lot of, for me, about the morals of writing about real people is, it's intention. It's like, I've met a handful of people sometimes who are like, I'm really writing out of vengeance. And I don't think that's necessarily bad, but I think it can cross over, and I'm not talking about like family abuse. It was like, I'm going to get back at my ex-boyfriend. And I was like, well, I don't know. For me, I just felt like my moral imperative was for my younger self, for other survivors. I was just like, I really want to tell the story for you. And, it took 10 years for a reason. And, I mean, close readers will notice that like most, or maybe they won't notice, but like the main characters in the book, it's like mostly me, it's my parents, it's my abusive ex, and then a handful of characters who are anonymized, right? And there was a real pull where I would like, there was one point where I was like, I want to document what was happening in the community. And then there was some like, not the whole thing I took out, but there were bits I took out because I was like, I think that's edging into me telling someone else's story, which is maybe about them being an abuse survivor. Maybe that's the specific things that's not really mine to tell yet, right? And they're my peers, so I'm going to tread carefully. I changed my parents' names, which is really weird, right? And I didn't do that. I didn't give a fuck, but I was like, well, if they sue me, like that wouldn't be great. If I change their names, they can't. So, all right. And yeah, just echoing what Tanya said, it's interesting because there's like the book came out and everyone was like, congratulations. And I wanted to hide under a rock and die and burn every copy of it because I was like, it's not poetry. People are going to give a shit now. They're going to read it. And what I discovered that's interesting, which other people have borne out, is that there's so much fear when you're a survivor of things writing about your family that they're going to like come for you. And then actually, whether it's saving face or shame, they have more to lose by being like, yeah, that is me, than by just trying to pretend it's not happening. So I was waiting to hear from my family and I did not hear a goddamn thing. And even people who, I went to a fairly small high school where I grew up, and some of them came to readings and they had, none of them have been like, oh, that's what was happening. It's silence, which, I mean, it's good and bad. It's like awful because it's what rape culture is. It's the continued silence, right? And then also it leaves room to be like, you're not going to kill me for writing it and publishing it.
Thank you. Our next question is from Sheila, who's asking, what is your ideal vision for the future of queer/brown/diasporic literature? And how would you like your subsequent projects to be situated in relation to that ideal vision?
Do you want, I can go. Is that okay? Oh man, well, I just want more, and it's interesting because the publishing climate in North America has changed in the last 5 years in a way that shocks me. Because when like Dirty River, everyone was like people literally said to me, queer women of color don't buy books. There's no market. And I would try and be like, well, actually, we're going to be the majority here soon, and all the ones I know read. So hey, but I was really lucky that Brian Lamb took a chance on me at Arsenal Pulp, and he's been such a champion of other Black and brown writers who are queer. But now it's 5 years later, and I'm like, oh my God, there's like a lot of queer brown writers on Random House. What happened? And like Alicia Garza is about to be he's already, on the bestseller list. And I'm not saying it's easy, but it's like there's been a bit of a change in mainstream publishing where they're like, oh, there's a market. I don't think they care about us all the way, but they realize that actually queer and Black and brown people do write books and read books. So that's great, but I want our books to get out there and be widely distributed and available, but I don't want it to just be the corporate publishers publishing us as a success story. I want there to be 1 million independent presses that are supported, that publish all kinds of things. I want us to be able to make a living at our writing, because if you don't think you can make a living at this, you don't do it, right? You're gonna go be an engineer or whatever, like whatever it is, or just keep doing whatever you're doing. And I want more space for us to be in conversation with each other and to be able to not always be referring to white, cis, straight men as, the norm in writing. It was interesting. I was on a panel at a Writers of Color festival a couple years ago, and the other 3 writers were very much more mainstream, mostly straight, though not fully writers of color. And they were just like, well, the mainstream sucks, but that's the only measure of success. I mean, what else can you do? And I was like, well, my role model is Audre Lorde, and she was never published on a mainstream publisher. Like, look at someone like Leslie Feinberg. I mean, Stone Butch Blues is a book that changed the world, and it's an indie, and now it's a free PDF. I really miss some of the 80s and 90s with the space that was in North America for independent publishing that has gotten really small, right? And just the economics of queer and queer of color publishing then. And I don't think we can go back there, but I want a modern version of it. And I want more flexibility. Like, I have a friend who's just like, what if we could go back to the epistolary novel where it's like letters, where it's like a chapter a week? Like, that'd be cool. And I was like, yeah, I think there still is pressure to not be experimental or be like, have a really, like, one person, they're very sweet, but they're like, can you be the disabled brown Lindy West, of Shrill? And I was like, we don't really write the same. Is that the only way that we can do it and get a book deal? Like that, I don't want that to be true. So yeah. Plus, not dying in nuclear war, ecological collapse, or coups or repression of any kind. That's what I want. High bar.
Oh dear. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of my feelings about this definitely overlap with your response. I mean, in terms of the labels, queer, brown, and diasporic, to me, ideally, all the stories that come under these labels would be so incredibly diverse, the labels almost lose meaning. Like, the labels almost are too singular to kind of contain the amount of diversity that should be there. And I think a lot of that has to do with what Leah said about, what is a measure of success. The lack of diverse voices for me has a lot to do with gatekeeping, and whether that's gatekeeping around who gets published by mainstream press, or whether independent publishers are supposedly less valid, than a mainstream press, or there's all sorts of things going, even within queer communities, or brown communities, there's all sorts of gatekeepings of what stories are okay to tell, or I don't know, even when you write into an agent, you're always expected to say this book is going to be like A, B, C, D. I think it's a real problem that regardless of what or what writer you are, who you are, that the first step is to compare yourself to something that exists, that's there. That is also a form of how to make things not change, yeah, or not evolve. I mean, ideally, yeah, my vision for the future of queer brown diasporic literature is that it's just so much more immense than it is now, both in terms of the stories that are told, the forms in which those stories come in, um, the platforms upon which those stories arrive. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap up the Q&A with one last question for Tanya. This is a question from CK, who's asking about whether you think that Singaporean society is becoming more accepting of LGBT groups, and to tack on sort of to that question, how maybe does the change in Singapore affect your own relationship to home? How does this show up in your art and your writing? And finally, your hopes for the publication of And the Walls Come Crumbling Down in North America. A lot of questions, I'm sorry.
It's okay. So I think, one of the key problems with this issue is that this is how we've been taught to look at it. Is society becoming more accepting of LGBTQ people in Singapore, as though we are not part of society, right? Who are we talking about when we ask that question? Are we talking about policymakers? Are we talking about the people with large influence over policymakers? It's society doesn't have to become more accepting of LGBTQ people. We are part of society. Policy needs to change. And policy has not changed. I mean, I can't really answer this question. I've not, like, for example, done a whole survey of my neighborhood and everyone in every, flat. There's no way I can answer this. I don't know what is in, the hearts and minds of people, but honestly, it shouldn't matter. I think is my stand on it. I don't know, and it shouldn't matter. Yeah. I'm sorry, I forgot the rest of the question.
Sure. The rest of the question was, how do these changes in Singapore sort of affect your own complicated relationship to a notion of home? How does that show up in your art and your writing? And lastly, what are your hopes and intentions for the North American launch of And the Walls Come Crumbling Down?
What was the first one?
No worries. The first, no worries. Yeah, so how do these potential changes and fluctuations in Singapore, how does that affect your own relationship to this complicated notion
Right.
of home? And how does that changing relationship and those complicated feelings, how do they show up in your art and writing today or in the future?
I mean, I definitely think that since moving, when I was in Singapore, I was writing a lot about queerness from a very kind of personal point of view in terms of relationships and, friendships and just a lot of feelings. Since coming here and, getting some distance, my writing has shifted towards really writing about Singapore from a step back. And that has involved articulating a lot of anger, articulating a lot of sadness, articulating a lot of disappointment. It's also really interesting kind of coming here how in Singapore, every time, for example, Singapore Writers Festival, there's like a queer panel and it's like Tanya, and hi Cyril, I know you're here, Chuck, Tanya, and Cyril on it. And, you know, always kind of like the speaking to the queer experience. And the minute I'm here, the first panel I was on was speaking to the Asian experience. So that's, I mean, that's been a really interesting thing for me, right? Because that's not something I had to think about when I was at home. So it's yeah, I think how it's changed my writing is definitely, I think I'm writing from further away. That's how I would sum it up. I'm writing from further away, and yeah. I know there was the last question in there that I missed.
No worries. Thanks, Tanya. Just
Sorry.
super quickly, you know, what are your hopes and intentions for the North American launch of And the Walls Come Crumbling Down?
I mean, I hope people like it. They don't have to. Obviously, every time we put something out, we hope people like it. It's less about hopes and intentions. I think more about, I am curious to find out whether it resonates here in the same way. Because I think writing from the same space, a lot of the time we take for granted that the kind of reactions we get, whether they're positive or negative, are universal, and often they're not. They're very, very measured by time, place, context. So yeah, I'm just curious to see what the reaction is.
Great, thank you so much. So we'll wrap up the Q&A for now. Thank you so much, Leah and Tanya, for both your such thoughtful readings and thoughtful responses today, but also thank you for the work that you do and push forward in your artistic and political life.
Thank you so much, Judy, for actually leading that discussion at the Q&A with such a wide, range of questions, touching upon, life as well as art, the art of writing, of course. And, our heartfelt thanks to Leah and to Tanya actually for, engaging with Judy in this, conversation and being so generous in sharing about your life and your writing. What strikes me, of course, is that even these books are not new books. For you, you have gone on to actually publish newer books, and you have probably some writing projects going on. But you spoke of these books still with such passion that it's as if those experiences just happened to you yesterday, right? I mean, the writing does that, right? Because it kind of preserves almost in ember, right? These really searing experiences that we had, and so make them and keep them alive, and so I guess remind us of our past as if it is the present. So thank you so much, all right, for being so honest and about your work. And now, I just want to tell everybody that, you should check out the books by these authors. One of the questions was about, what's the vision for, queer brown diaspora publishing? Well, there's no vision if you're not going to buy books. Speaking as the Gaudy Boy publisher here too, as well as on behalf of all indie independent publishers, all right, because we really do need your support to do the things that we're trying to do, all right, for the authors that we believe in. So, we're going to wrap up this event now, and we sincerely hope that you've enjoyed, this discussion and this reading brought to you by Singapore Unbound. Now, tomorrow, authors Nuralia Norasid and Rico Villanueva Siasoko will be discussing the political possibilities of the short story on the second day of the festival. And also tomorrow, the novelist Amanda Lee Koh and poet Paula Mendoza will be speaking about who or what they celebrate in their work. So please join us, all right, for the second as well as the third day of the festival. Now, if you like what Singapore Unbound is doing for cultural exchange, freedom of expression, and equal rights, please consider making a generous donation at Fractured Atlas, our fiscal sponsor. We rely on champions like you to do the work that we do. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I hope you had as great a time as I did, and I hope our authors did too. And we hope to see you, all right, for the rest of the festival. All right, so bye for now. Good night.